Have you ever wondered how your life would look if you were born into another family?
At Christmas, my sister rolled her eyes and said, with that infuriating tone she reserves for when she wants to sound casual but fully intends to sting, she just posts online all day, and although she didn't say my name, she didn't have to. Everyone at that table knew exactly who she meant, just like they always knew, year after year, holiday after holiday, that I was the target of the family's polite mockery, the one who somehow never managed to live up to their very narrow version of success, the black sheep with perfect makeup and expensive luggage, the one who flew in from Los Angeles instead of driving in from across town, the one who never quite grew up, at least not by their standards, which were so outdated and inflexible they might as well have been carved into stone by the hands of guilt and tradition themselves. The words came just as Mom was shuffling to the table with the scalloped potatoes, slightly burnt on the edges, just like every year, and I was reaching for my second glass of Cabernet, the one I hoped would take the edge off the way it usually did. The way it had to, because there was no way I was going to survive 3 hours at this table without numbing the sharpness that always seemed to rise from beneath the surface like oil on old water. The kids were still shouting in the den, some animated cartoons screaming in the background, and Dad was already halfway through a highball of whiskey, not offering commentary because, let's face it, the man hadn't really said anything of substance to me since I dropped out of college 12 years ago. The air smelled like ham, disappointment, and whatever passive resentment families seem to generate when they're all forced to sit in one place and pretend like everything's fine. I didn't even flinch at Lauren's words, not outwardly, because flinching would have meant she got what she wanted, which was a reaction, and I've spent far too many years learning how to pretend that comments like that roll off me like rain on a windshield, when in reality, they slice me open with the familiarity of 1,000 paper cuts. I kept my face perfectly still, nodded slightly, the way you do when someone says something so ignorant it's not even worth acknowledging, and I went back to buttering my dinner roll with the fake smile I've mastered over years of family functions. The kind of smile that says I'm above this, even though I'm not really, not deep down. But just as the tension began to curdle and solidify in the space between us, my Aunt Janice, who had been uncharacteristically quiet up to that point, sipping her white wine with the kind of practiced indifference only a woman in her 60s who's lived through 3 husbands and 2 bankruptcies can manage, turned to me, eyes sharp and voice calm as a still lake before a storm, and said, "Didn't you just hit 10 million subscribers?" And in that instant, it was as though someone had taken a carving knife to the illusion of normalcy at the table, slicing it open and letting the truth bleed out across the good tablecloth. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was surgical. It was cold and clean and absolute, the kind of silence that makes you realize how much noise had been filling the room before it vanished, the kind that pulls the breath out of your chest and freezes it midair, waiting for something to break. Forks stopped halfway to mouths, children looked up from their screens, and Mom, still holding a dish towel in one hand, paused like someone had hit the mute button on her life. Lauren didn't even turn her head, she just froze, her mouth slightly open, the insult she had lined up next dying in her throat before it could take shape. I didn't respond immediately, because I didn't need to. Janice had done more with that one sentence than I could have done with a 5-minute monologue defending my work, my choices, my entire goddamn existence. But as the silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable like a wool blanket in July, I finally met Lauren's eyes, and in that moment, I could see the flash of something that had nothing to do with disapproval or concern or even confusion. It was fear. Just a flicker, but it was there, and it made me straighten my spine a little more than usual as I gently placed my wine glass back on the table. 10 million. That number doesn't mean anything to most people outside of the digital world, but inside, in the space I've carved out with late nights and raw honesty and relentless discipline, 10 million means empire. It means not just success, but power, influence, reach. It means that when I speak, millions listen. It means that I've built something real, something lasting, something that doesn't need their validation to exist. And it especially means that the girl they still think of as a flaky, artsy underachiever is now someone they can't quite explain away anymore. Lauren tried to laugh, that awkward, dismissive sound she uses when she feels cornered but doesn't want to show it, and said, "Well, I guess people will watch anything these days," and I swear I could see Aunt Janice's jaw twitch, just for a second. Like she wanted to say more but decided against it. Instead, she leaned forward slightly and added, "I saw the CNN piece. That brand you built, it's impressive. Real impressive." Her voice wasn't warm or congratulatory, it was factual, like a weather report or a financial summary, and that, somehow, made it hit harder. My mother, bless her heart, blinked like someone had turned the lights too bright and asked, half to me, half to the air, "You were on CNN," as though I hadn't emailed her the link, as though I hadn't texted her when it aired, as though she hadn't replied with a thumbs-up emoji and then never brought it up again. "Yes," I said simply, not bothering to elaborate, because I was done explaining things to people who chose not to understand them. Lauren's husband, Mike, who had barely said a word all evening, finally looked up from his plate and asked, "Is that the video you shot in that, what's it called, Bali?" And before I could answer, Lauren interrupted, "It's not real work, Mike. It's just filming herself. That's not a job. That's attention-seeking." The way she spat the word filming made it sound dirty, like a sin I was too shameless to hide. I took a deep breath, steady and slow, and said, "I've built a company. I have employees. I've paid more in taxes this year than most people make in 5. But yeah, sure, I just post online all day." I said it with a calmness that didn't match the fire in my chest, and I saw it land, saw it ripple through them like a crack in ice, subtle but growing, deepening with every beat of silence that followed. Then I stood up, carefully, not in a dramatic flurry but with the quiet grace of someone who no longer needed to prove anything, and I said I needed to get some air. No one stopped me. No one asked if I was okay. I walked out the front door into the frigid Ohio night, coatless, letting the cold slap me back into myself, and as I stood on the porch breathing in the sharp December air, I realized that maybe this was exactly the moment I had been waiting for, not to win, not to gloat, but to finally, fully let go of the need for their approval. And as the snow started to fall, soft and slow like ashes from a dying fire, I knew that this Christmas wouldn't end the way the others did, with me swallowing my words and shrinking into my chair. This time, they had heard me even if they didn't want to, and that was only the beginning. There's a strange, uncomfortable kind of nostalgia that creeps in when you sleep in your childhood bedroom as an adult, not the soft, wistful kind that fills you with warmth, but the kind that presses against your chest like a memory you never invited in, reminding you with every creaky floorboard and peeling poster on the wall of exactly who you used to be and how hard you had to fight to become someone else. That night, after slipping away from the suffocating awkwardness of the dinner table and the forced smiles that had begun to crack like cheap porcelain, I found myself sitting on the edge of my old bed. The one with the warped wooden headboard and the scratch I once blamed on the dog, but secretly made myself when I was 13 and angry at the world. The mattress sagged more than I remembered, and the air still smelled faintly of lavender lotion and dust, the scent of a girl who once lay awake here every night, dreaming of escape. It's funny how the past doesn't just stay in the past in this house. It waits for you, crouching in the corners of the room and hiding in the drawers you thought were empty, ready to pounce the moment you let your guard down. I glanced at the corkboard above the desk, still littered with old theater tickets, a fading snapshot of me and a friend I haven't spoken to in over a decade, and a piece of paper with a list I'd written in thick black Sharpie when I was 15. Things I will do before I'm 30. The list was naive, even sweet in its optimism: move to California, make my own money, fall in love with someone who gets me, buy mom a new car, be famous enough to never come back here unless I want to, and even though I'd technically done most of those things, reading it now felt more like a confrontation than a celebration. Because no matter how far I've gone, how high I've climbed, or how many milestones I've quietly crushed while no one was watching, coming back here always turns me back into that awkward, too sensitive teenager who wore combat boots with dresses and spent lunch periods editing videos alone in the library because the cafeteria felt like a battlefield. Back then, Lauren was the queen of everything: homecoming, honor society, the future PTA, and I was just her weird little sister, the one who couldn't sit still, couldn't blend in, and couldn't seem to care about anything that didn't involve a camera and a dream no one else could see. I remember one afternoon during my junior year when Lauren, already in college but home for the weekend, walked into my room uninvited while I was filming. She looked around at my makeshift backdrop, the stack of shoeboxes holding up my phone, and the piles of scribbled video ideas scattered on the floor, and she didn't say anything right away. She just laughed, this low, pitying laugh that made me want to shrink into the carpet. Then she said, "You know none of this is going to matter, right? No one wants to watch you talk about your stupid little life." And then she walked out, leaving the door open behind her like the insult needed room to breathe. I didn't cry, not right away, but I remember deleting that video. I remember thinking, just for a second, that maybe she was right. That maybe no one would ever care. But people did care. Not right away, not all at once, but slowly, surely, and then all at once. The girl who didn't fit in anywhere suddenly found herself with an audience who didn't just listen, they related, they understood, they saw themselves in me. And over time, as the channel grew and I started turning views into income, then into opportunity, then into independence, I stopped needing the validation I'd spent so long chasing. Or at least, I thought I did. Until I came back here. Lying in that bed, staring at the ceiling that still bore the glow-in-the-dark stars I'd stuck there when I was 12, I thought about all the birthdays I'd spent editing videos alone, the holidays I'd skipped to meet deadlines, the friends I'd lost when they didn't understand the commitment it took to keep building something out of nothing. I thought about the messages I still get from strangers who tell me my work helped them through something hard, something silent, something no one else seemed to understand. And then I thought about Lauren's voice at dinner, the way she said it. She just posts online all day, as if that wasn't a job, as if that wasn't real, as if I hadn't spent the last 10 years proving people like her wrong. And just when I was about to get up and shut off the light, I heard a faint knock on the door. It opened a crack, and Mike, Lauren's husband, peeked in, holding his phone in one hand like a student with a guilty question. "Hey," he said, voice low so it wouldn't carry down the hall. "Sorry to bother you. I was just wondering, that video you did, the one with the home office makeover? Did you really get that brand to pay for all of it?" His tone wasn't mocking. It was curious. Maybe even respectful. I nodded slowly and said, "Yeah, that one was sponsored by a furniture startup. They gave me a 15 grand budget." His eyes widened just slightly, and he said, "Damn," in a way that didn't sound like pity. Then he added, "I might need to ask you some questions about my business's Instagram. Lauren said you probably wouldn't mind." I didn't say yes, and I didn't say no. I just smiled, polite and distant, and said, "Maybe tomorrow." He nodded, said goodnight, and closed the door behind him. Lying back on the pillow, I couldn't help but laugh quietly, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. Lauren spent the entire dinner trying to drag me down, and here was her own husband, sneaking into my room to ask how I did it. That was the thing about family. They might not clap for you in public, but the minute they think it might benefit them, they show up, hand outstretched, like they always believed in you. Like they were never the ones whispering behind your back when you couldn't hear, or worse, when you could. But I wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger would come later, in colder, quieter waves. For now, I just stared at the ceiling and let the past walk around the room, brushing against my shoulders and whispering its tired old scripts. I listened. Then I closed my eyes and reminded myself that I hadn't made it this far just to shrink again. And tomorrow, when the casserole was cold and the smiles even more forced, I'd make sure they remembered that too. The following morning unfolded with the kind of stale, restrained politeness that tends to hang in the air after a family dinner that didn't end in outright war, but instead simmered with the kind of unresolved tension that everyone agreed to ignore out of mutual exhaustion and generations of learned avoidance. The house smelled like reheated ham, burnt coffee, and the overly floral candle my mother insisted on lighting during the holidays, even though everyone quietly hated it. I sat at the kitchen island, slowly stirring a spoon in a mug I had no intention of drinking from, watching the cream swirl into the coffee like it was hypnotic, Like it could somehow distract me from the way every interaction in that house was a careful negotiation between what was said and what was meant. Lauren was already dressed, of course, not in anything festive or relaxed, but in the kind of outfit that screamed, "I control the narrative," complete with a sharp blazer over a cashmere turtleneck and those stiff jeans that never look comfortable but are, somehow, a crucial part of her performance. She hovered by the sink, scrolling on her phone like she wasn't eavesdropping, but the way her ears twitched slightly every time someone said my name told me otherwise. Mike wasn't around, probably out running an errand he didn't need to run just to escape the mounting static between his wife and me. Mom was setting out leftover muffins like we were at some sort of quaint bed and breakfast instead of a house filled with barely suppressed resentment. It wasn't until Aunt Janice came into the room, her slippers scraping across the tile, that the tension thickened enough to taste. She didn't greet anyone, didn't make small talk or ask who wanted eggs. She just sat down across from me, looked me directly in the eyes, and asked, "So, how much does a video actually make you?" And just like that, the silence was back, not as loud as it had been at dinner, but heavier somehow, more purposeful. I could feel Lauren freeze behind me, phone still in hand, but no longer scrolling. Mom sighed, a small, resigned puff of air, and muttered something about going to check the laundry, as if the dryer had suddenly become a source of urgent interest. I took a breath, slow and deliberate, because I'd learned the hard way that when you start talking about money, especially real money, especially in front of people who've spent their whole lives equating value with titles and offices and hour-long commutes, you have to decide whether you're answering to inform or to disarm. And in that moment, I chose neither. I chose clarity. "Depends on the video," I said slowly, keeping my tone neutral, as if I were describing weather patterns instead of income brackets. A brand deal can be anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000, sometimes more if it's exclusive. Then there's ad revenue, affiliate links, merchandise, licensing. It adds up. Janice didn't blink. "So, you're doing well." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "I'm doing fine." And that was the truth, fine in the way that meant I wasn't worried about bills, about the future, about whether I'd have enough for a down payment or a retirement plan. Fine in the way that meant I'd reached a point where saying yes or no to opportunities wasn't based on desperation, but choice. But saying that out loud in this kitchen, in front of Lauren, would have felt like peeling back skin for no reason other than to expose a wound no one else was willing to acknowledge. So I said it in the way that sounded humble, unthreatening, safe. Lauren finally spoke, voice sharp and bright as a chipped wine glass. "That's cute. I mean, good for you. Everyone has their thing, right? Some of us just prefer actual careers." She laughed a little too loudly at her own sentence, the sound brittle and empty. I turned slightly to look at her, and it struck me then. She wasn't angry because she didn't understand what I did. She was angry because, deep down, she did. She knew that my world, the one she mocked with such practiced indifference, didn't require her validation to exist. That while she was attending meetings and crafting PowerPoints and attending webinars on strategic synergy, I was being flown out to events where people knew my name before I even walked in the room. Being paid to speak on panels about authenticity and engagement while she scrolled through internal newsletters hoping for a mention from upper management. She knew. And that knowledge, that awareness that all her structure and discipline hadn't insulated her from envy, was eating her alive. I didn't rise to her bait. I didn't offer her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. Instead, I turned back to Janice, who was still watching me with that same unreadable expression, and said, "My last campaign was with a financial tech company. I created a 3-part video series. It brought in $72,000. Took me 3 weeks. The numbers hung in the air like smoke, visible, undeniable, and impossible to pretend weren't real." Lauren dropped her phone onto the counter with more force than necessary and muttered something under her breath, something about show-offs and priorities, but I let it go. Because then came the moment that shifted the entire room, the moment that cracked open the years of false superiority and forced smiles. I pulled up an email on my phone and held it up, not to Janice, not to Mom, but directly toward Lauren. "Remember when you applied for that mortgage last year?" I said calmly, not needing to raise my voice, because the words were heavy enough on their own. The anonymous cosigner you never figured out? That was me. I did that. I saved your application from getting rejected. Lauren's face drained of color so quickly it was almost impressive. You're lying, she said, but her voice didn't sound like conviction. It sounded like panic. Why would you even do that? I shrugged. Because Mom asked me to. Because I knew you'd never accept help from me directly. Because, unlike you, I don't measure worth by who wins dinner conversations. I just wanted to help. I didn't say it with malice, but it landed with the weight of truth that had been denied oxygen for too long. Janice stood up slowly, collected her mug, and gave me the smallest nod, the kind that didn't need words to convey its meaning. Then she left the room, leaving me, Lauren, and the silence to sit in the mess we'd all helped make. I got up, walked to the fridge, and poured myself a glass of water. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't crack. And in that moment, with Lauren standing stiff by the sink, unable to look at me, I realized that the fight I'd been bracing for all these years, the one I thought would end with shouting and tears and some explosive, cathartic confrontation, had already ended. Not with a bang, but with the simple, undeniable fact that the numbers didn't lie. And neither did I. That afternoon, I left the house for a walk, ignoring the text from Mom asking if I wanted to go through the Christmas ornaments or help peel potatoes. I walked through the neighborhood that once felt like a prison and now felt impossibly small, and I breathed deeply, not just because I needed air, but because, for the first time in a long while, I could finally fill my lungs without the weight of needing to be seen, to be approved, to be believed. They had seen enough. And tomorrow, I'd show them even more. The next morning unfolded not with the sound of cheerful carols or laughter drifting through the hallway, as holiday commercials would have you believe, but with the dull clatter of dishes in the sink and the distant whirring of the old washing machine churning away somewhere in the basement, a soundtrack to yet another day of pretending everything was fine when, in reality, everyone in that house was still recovering from the blow delivered the day before, a blow that came not from shouting or accusation, but from a calm voice and a figure they had refused, for too long, to take seriously. I came downstairs dressed in a soft knit sweater, my hair tied back loosely, no makeup, no camera-ready face, just me, stripped of pretense, with nothing to prove and no interest in smoothing over what had already been exposed. The kitchen smelled like burnt toast and bitter coffee, and the silence that had taken hold after my revelation about the mortgage still lingered like a cloud that refused to lift, thickening around every half-hearted exchange of pleasantries and forced smiles that cracked before they could reach the eyes. I found Aunt Janice at the kitchen table, her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose, leafing slowly through a battered copy of a mystery novel that looked like it had been read and reread until the spine surrendered. She looked up as I entered, her eyes steady, and without any of the awkward small talk the others had resorted to, she gestured to the chair across from her and said, "Sit. You've got that look like something's still on your chest." I sat, grateful for the directness, for the absence of the sugar-coated nonsense that filled the rest of this house, and took a moment to look around at the chipped ceramic fruit bowl on the counter, the curling edges of a decade-old live, laugh, love sign above the pantry, and the sheer weight of memories that lived in the walls like mildew. Janice didn't look at me like I was a spectacle, or a curiosity, or a problem that needed fixing. She looked at me like someone who knew what it meant to live a life that wasn't built to make other people comfortable, someone who understood the cost of building something for yourself in a world that preferred women small, agreeable, and predictable. "You know," she said, tapping her nail lightly against her mug, "when I was your age, I was still begging my second husband to let me open a checking account in my own name. And here you are, talking about brand deals and revenue streams and carrying your sister's mortgage without blinking." Her voice wasn't filled with awe, just a quiet sort of recognition that felt heavier than praise. "You ever think maybe the problem isn't them not getting it? Maybe the problem is they do, and they hate what that means?" That question sat between us like a stone dropped in still water, its ripples slow and unsettling. Because she was right, they understood more than they let on. Lauren, with her tight smile and brittle jabs, wasn't confused about my success. She was threatened by it. Mom wasn't oblivious to what I'd built. She just didn't know how to reconcile the daughter she raised, the one who wore mismatched socks and forgot school picture days, with the woman who now had an accountant, a legal team, and the kind of independence she never dared to ask for herself. They understood. And understanding turned to resentment faster than anyone was willing to admit. I leaned back in my chair and let the words form slowly, deliberately, like I was testing their truth as I spoke them. I used to think if I just worked hard enough, if I hit a certain number, if I got featured in the right place, they'd finally see me, and I wouldn't have to keep proving myself every time I stepped into this house. But I'm starting to realize it's not about the number. It never was. It's about control. About who gets to be proud of who. And I think they don't know how to be proud of someone who didn't need their approval to begin with. Janice smiled slightly, not the kind of smile you give when someone tells a joke, but the kind you offer when you recognize your own truth reflected back at you, softened only by time and perspective. Took me 2 marriages and a real estate license to figure that one out, she said, standing to pour herself another cup of coffee, the pot hissing slightly as she refilled it. You're ahead of schedule. The rest of the day passed like a slow march toward something inevitable. The tension between Lauren and me was no longer a low simmer, but a visible line drawn across every shared glance and half-formed sentence. She didn't speak to me directly. Instead, she filtered every interaction through Mom or Mike, pretending I wasn't there while making it perfectly clear I was the subject of her every thought. At one point, I caught her in the living room whispering furiously into her phone, her hand cupped over the speaker, and when she noticed me watching, she turned her back like I was a stranger. That would have bothered me once, the cold shoulder, the willful rejection, but now it just confirmed what Janice had said. This wasn't about confusion. This was about control. Later in the afternoon, as everyone gathered around the tree for what was supposed to be a warm, Hallmark-style family moment, Mom tried to resurrect some semblance of tradition by asking me to hand out the presents. It was a clumsy attempt at inclusion, one that felt more like stage direction than genuine goodwill, but I did it anyway, because I wasn't there to pick a fight. I was there to be present, even if they didn't know what to do with me. One by one, I passed out the gifts, scarves, books, department store gift sets that still had the sales stickers on them, and finally came to the one addressed to me, a soft, rectangular package with my name in Mom's handwriting. I opened it slowly, not out of suspense, but out of dread, and found inside a stack of motivational desk calendars, each one featuring a different quote about hustle, productivity, and not giving up. It would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. The irony of receiving advice from people who had never once asked me what I actually did with my time was so thick I could barely breathe. I said thank you, of course, because that's what you do, even when what you want to say is, you think I need a calendar to remind me to work harder? I built an empire while you were busy pretending I wasn't serious. But I didn't say that. I just smiled and tucked the gift under my chair. That night, while the rest of the family settled into post-gift lethargy, I checked my email and saw the notification I'd been waiting for, a new brand deal, locked and confirmed. Worth 6 figures and involving a major retail chain that had been chasing me for months. I replied with a brief, professional confirmation, then closed my laptop and sat there in the quiet, the flickering lights of the Christmas tree casting faint shadows across the room. I could have told them. I could have stood up and announced that while they were handing me calendars about persistence, I was finalizing a deal that would fund my next year of content and expand my production team. I could have told Mom I was finally in a position to buy her the car on that list from 15 years ago. I could have even offered Lauren a referral for a digital strategist, since Mike clearly still wanted help with their struggling business. But I didn't say a word, because sometimes silence is louder than anything you could shout. And sometimes, the best revenge isn't a clever retort or a dramatic exit, it's knowing, deep in your bones, that you no longer need their recognition to validate your reality. I folded the contract confirmation into the inside pocket of my laptop sleeve, stood up quietly, and turned off the tree lights. Let them think the lights went out because it was late. Let them sit in the dark and wonder, just for a second, what they missed while they weren't paying attention. The truth wasn't something I needed to shout anymore. The truth was in the bank. The morning of my departure arrived not with a sense of closure or sentimental fondness, but rather with that strange and familiar emotional heaviness that clings to you after a family gathering steeped in unspoken resentment, misdirected comparisons, and the type of discomfort that simmers beneath civility, never quite boiling over yet always threatening to. I woke before the rest of the house stirred, the dim, gray light of a winter morning slipping in through the slats of the blinds, casting long streaks across the floor of my childhood bedroom where the edges of the past still lurked. Not in the form of tangible artifacts, but in the very energy of the space, as though the walls themselves remembered every eye roll, every muttered dismissal, every quiet moment of shame that had gone unnoticed by others, but imprinted itself permanently on me. I dressed in silence, not hurriedly, but with the kind of deliberate care that suggested a goodbye, though not necessarily one that would be noticed. I didn't pack everything. I left behind the desk calendar, still unopened, stacked beside a half-eaten box of peanut brittle someone had gifted without much thought, and I took only what I came with, plus a printed copy of the contract I had finalized the night before, folded neatly and placed at the bottom of my carry-on like a secret, powerful and private, not because I wanted to hide it, but because it didn't need to be displayed to be real. That deal, that opportunity, that validation, it wasn't meant for their applause. It was meant for me. Downstairs, the house was quiet except for the familiar creak of the floorboard by the stairs and the hum of the refrigerator that had outlived 2 dishwashers and probably everyone's patience. I walked into the kitchen and found Aunt Janice already at the table, sipping coffee from her old ceramic mug that read, "Retired, but not expired," her hair wrapped in a silk scarf, and her eyes already on me before I could say anything. She didn't ask why I was leaving early. She didn't ask what had happened or if I was upset or if I needed anything, because she already knew, not just the details, but the feeling. The gravity of existing in a space that insists on seeing you through the lens of your past, no matter how drastically your present contradicts it. She slid a second mug toward me, filled without asking how I liked it, and said only one thing: "Did you leave them anything to think about?" It was a good question, one that echoed in my chest as I sipped the coffee, still too hot, slightly bitter, exactly right. Because that had been the real question all along, hadn't it? Not whether they would ever applaud me, not whether they'd learn to see beyond their narrow expectations, but whether I could leave this house, this version of myself, this entire curated theater of family dynamics, having finally shifted something. Even if they didn't admit it, even if they never spoke it aloud. I left a note. Not for Mom, not for Lauren, not for Mike or the kids or even myself. I left it for Janice, folded neatly, tucked into the inside flap of her book like a page she'd mark for later, something to return to when the room fell quiet again. In it, I wrote only this: "Thank you for seeing me." Not just the numbers. Not just the headlines. Me. Because in the end, it wasn't the accolades or the contracts or the view counts that mattered. It was the rare and sacred moment of being recognized without translation, without pretense, without needing to defend who I'd become. When the Uber pulled up to the driveway, its tires crunching softly over the thin layer of frost on the gravel, I stepped outside into the morning chill, the kind that bites at your skin just enough to remind you that you're alive, that you're not numb even when you wish you were. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't wait for someone to come to the door or wave or pretend like they were going to miss me. I just opened the car door, got in, and watched the house grow smaller in the rearview mirror as we pulled away. A week later, on New Year's Eve, I received a group text from my mother, a blurry photo of the kitchen with a table full of appetizers, 2 bottles of discount champagne, and the caption, "Everyone's coming by at 8. Wish you were here." I stared at it for a while, not with anger or sadness, but with a strange and quiet detachment, like looking at a postcard from a place you used to live but no longer call home. There were replies from cousins and aunts, the usual excitement and obligatory emojis, and then, as I scrolled through, I saw one message that stood out, a single sentence from Janice that read, "Depends who's at the table." That was it. No drama. No confrontation. Just a gentle refusal to sit where she no longer felt seen, and in that moment, I realized the legacy of that visit wasn't going to be a tearful reunion or a grand reckoning, but something quieter, more powerful, an absence that couldn't be filled. A chair left empty not out of spite, but out of purpose. That night, while they counted down to midnight and toasted to another year of pretending everything was fine, I sat on the balcony of my apartment in Los Angeles, watching fireworks bloom over the city skyline, sipping from a glass of wine that cost more than my first month of rent in that house, and feeling, for the first time, completely whole in my own company. Because revenge doesn't always look like confrontation or exposure. Sometimes, revenge is walking away so completely that the space you leave behind becomes a mirror they can't avoid, one that shows them who they were when they thought you weren't looking. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is leave a chair empty, not to make a statement, but because you finally know your worth well enough not to sit where you're not truly invited. So no, I didn't ruin Christmas. I didn't raise my voice or storm out or throw anyone's mistakes back at them. I just lived my truth with quiet clarity until it became impossible for them to pretend they hadn't heard it. And whether they ever acknowledge it or not, they will remember this holiday, not because of what was said, but because of what was no longer tolerated, and most of all, because of the one chair that stayed empty long after the dishes were cleared. The wine bottles were emptied, and the lights were turned off. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first year I celebrated Christmas on my own terms.